Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are stories hidden so deep in America's forgotten corners that most people will never hear them. Stories that live not in newspapers or history books, but in whispers, in family shame, in graves that were never marked. Tonight, you are about to hear one of them. A story the state of Kentucky would rather see vanish, a story locals still deny, a story of a girl forced into the most unnatural role any daughter could ever face. It happened in 1974, though to the people of the Hollow it could have been 1874 or 1774. Time did not move the same way there. Deep in the Appalachian hills, where the mountains guard their secrets and roads end long before the map does, a girl was dressed in white. But this was not a wedding the world was meant to witness. No church bells rang, no pastor stood at the altar. There were no guests, no celebration, just a cabin swallowed by trees, a father with eyes like stone, and a daughter too young to understand that her fate had been sealed long before she was even born. She was not married to a stranger, nor to a distant cousin, but to her own father. A man who believed bloodlines should never leave the family, a man whose control was absolute. And on that night, with only his kin gathered in silence, he placed his own daughter into a role she could never escape. Most Americans would never know she existed. Her name does not appear in records. Her face never made the papers. But fragments survive, faded photographs, whispers from neighbors who saw too much, medical notes that hint at truths doctors dared not write openly, and from these fragments a haunting picture forms. Who was she? Why was she chosen? And how could something so horrific happen not in the Middle Ages, not in some distant forgotten century, but in the modern heart of America? Tonight we peel back the silence. Tonight we tell the story of Kentucky's most forbidden bride. The Appalachian hills have always carried an uneasy silence, a silence that feels less like peace and more like a warning. Outsiders who wandered too far into the Kentucky backroads in the 1970s often described the landscape as beautiful but oppressive. The ridges seemed to watch you. The valleys felt too quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. For the families who lived there, though, this silence was not unusual. It was tradition, it was survival, and sometimes it was the perfect cover for secrets too terrible to speak aloud. Her family was one of the oldest in the Hollow. They had lived on that same patch of land for more than a century, since long before the Civil War. Their cabins had been rebuilt on the same stones, their fields ploughed by the same hands, their bloodlines looping tighter and tighter as the years passed. Few strangers ever came in, and even fewer were allowed to stay. In a world where outsiders were seen as threats, the family turned inward, marrying cousins, keeping the land and the blood pure, convincing themselves that this was the only way to survive. But with each generation, the cost grew heavier. Children were born with small deformities, a cleft lip here, a twisted spine there. Some never learned to speak properly, some never walked at all. Neighbors whispered about the ones who never left the porch, children who rocked silently in wooden chairs, their eyes vacant, their voices no more than murmurs. The family said little about them. They were hidden from view, shut away in rooms no visitor would ever see. This was the world the girl was born into. Her childhood was not filled with play or freedom, but with rules enforced by her father's voice and her father's fists. She did not attend school past a certain age. She did not have friends beyond her blood. The outside world was described to her as dangerous, sinful, and corrupting. She was told her place was in the home with the family, serving the family, belonging to the family. And all the while, the family was grooming her for something she could not yet comprehend. When she reached adolescence, whispers began to swirl. Relatives spoke of her future, though never directly to her. The unspoken truth hung in the air, heavier than coal dust. Her father was preparing her not for a husband from another town, not even for a cousin, but for himself. The bloodline would not be broken, the silence would not be disturbed. and she, unknowingly, was to become the next link in a chain that had been tightening for generations. The deeper you look into her story, the more it feels like a curse handed down across generations. Families in the Hollow had long practiced a form of isolation that blurred the line between survival and obsession. Land was scarce, outsiders untrusted, and so marriage became a matter of keeping wealth and property within bloodlines. To the people inside, this was not madness, it was loyalty, it was honor. But the human body and soul can only endure so much before the cracks begin to show. By the time she was born in the late 1950s, the signs were already written into her family's faces. Neighbors recalled crooked jaws, eyes too close together, and bodies frail from the weight of poor genetics compounded by poverty. Children of the clan often grew up underdeveloped, their minds clouded by conditions no doctor was ever allowed to name. The outside world referred to them in cruel nicknames: the Forgotten, the Porch People, the Hollow Ghosts. Yet inside the family, they were simply accepted as the price of tradition. The girl herself appeared healthy at first, though thin and timid. She had pale skin that burned quickly in the sun, hair that hung like a shadow across her face, and a way of moving as if she was always afraid of being seen. Some who met her in childhood remembered a faint spark in her eyes, as if she longed for something beyond the ridgeline, something she couldn't name. That spark would not last. Her father was already known as a man who ruled with fear. He had inherited not just the land, but the authority of generations before him. In the Hollow, his word was law. He decided when the family worked, when they rested, who ate first and who went without. And when his daughter reached womanhood, his eyes began to linger too long. Family gatherings carried an edge of unease. Cousins whispered, mothers averted their eyes. They knew what was coming, but none dared to stop it. For the girl, the realization came slowly. At first it was the way he controlled her dress, her hair, her very movements. Then came the warnings. That she was never to speak to men outside the family, never to look beyond the Hollow, never to think of a future different from the one he had chosen. She was property, not person. And in 1974, that property would be claimed. When the ceremony came, it was carried out not with joy, but with a suffocating silence. No music, no celebration, just a girl in white, trembling, and a father whose face bore no shame. She was not given away. She was taken. The wedding itself has become a kind of phantom, something everyone in the Hollow swears they never saw. Yet details leak out when alcohol loosens tongues, or when guilt gnaws too sharply in the dead of night. No official records exist, no minister's name is attached. The courthouse holds no license, no proof that the ceremony ever occurred, and yet the fragments tell us it did. A cousin spoke years later of being forced to stand in the corner of a cabin, watching his uncle lead the vows himself, as if he were both father and pastor. The girl wore a borrowed white dress, far too big for her frame, the sleeves sagging like a shroud. She did not smile. She did not cry. Her face was blank, as though whatever part of her had once lived was already gone. The father stood rigid, his wiry frame casting a long shadow against the oil lamp. He spoke in a monotone, asking her questions she could not answer. When he took her hand, he did not hold it gently, but clamped it at the wrist, as though claiming possession. Witnesses recalled the eerie silence, no music, no prayers, not even the sounds of insects from outside seemed to intrude. It was as if the Hollow itself understood what was happening and fell into mourning. Some say there is a photograph, faded, grainy, passed secretly between relatives like contraband. In it, the girl stares downward, her lips pressed shut, her shoulders tense. The man beside her looks into the camera with a grim pride, the kind of pride that only comes when someone believes he has carried out his duty. Whether that photograph still exists, hidden in a family Bible or locked in a trunk beneath floorboards, remains unknown, but the story has survived too consistently, too precisely, for it to be mere invention. And from that night forward, she was no longer treated as a daughter. She was a wife, at least in the twisted sense that her father defined theirs. E-word. She rose when he rose, she cooked his meals, she obeyed his commands, and when neighbors saw her again, their eyes turned away, for to acknowledge what had happened would mean admitting their own silence had allowed it. That was the cruelest part, not only her father's violence, but the valley's complicity. They let it happen, they buried it in silence, and in doing so, they chained her fate to the very land that had already claimed so many before her. In the weeks after that night, something inside her seemed to wither. A neighbor remembered glimpsing her by the creek, carrying buckets of water as she always had, but her face had changed. Gone was the shy spark of a young girl, replaced by the hollow stare of someone who had resigned themselves to a sentence they could never escape. People in the hollow noticed, but they did not speak. To acknowledge her suffering meant confronting the man who ruled not just his family, but in many ways, the entire valley. Few were willing to risk that. She was young, too young, and her body bore the cost almost immediately. Medical notes from a doctor in the nearest town mention a patient from the hills in 1975, a girl in her teens, already pregnant, malnourished, with fractures that suggested more than one accident. Though the doctor never dared to name her, locals whisper it could only have been her. The girl who had been forced into the role of wife before she was ready to be a woman. The child came quickly, too quickly, as if her body was not prepared to carry life at all. Rumors swirl about what became of it. Some insist the baby lived only a few days, its cries heard faintly before silence settled back over the cabin. Others believe the child survived but was hidden, rarely seen outside, raised as a shame too heavy for even the family to bear openly. Whatever the truth, the birth left her frail, weakened, and yet still bound to her father's grip. Neighbors described the strange quiet around the cabin during those years. No music, no laughter, no gatherings like other families sometimes held. Just silence, broken only by the sound of chopping wood, the clatter of water buckets, and the occasional sharp cry that echoed from inside. The girl no longer looked at anyone directly. Her voice, once timid but present, vanished almost entirely. She became a shadow moving through the hollow, doing what was demanded of her, but never more. The valley carried on as if nothing had happened. People went to church, worked their fields, and nodded politely when they passed her father on the road. And yet, beneath it all, a sense of unease grew. It was one thing to whisper about cousins marrying cousins, uncles taking nieces, but a man marrying his own daughter, that was something darker, something that could not be explained away as tradition. It was a wound in the community's conscience, and wounds like that never stay hidden forever. By 1976, fragments of her suffering began seeping beyond the hollow. Outsiders, traveling salesmen, state workers, even journalists documenting Appalachian poverty sometimes caught sight of her. They described the figure of a girl-woman standing in a doorway, hair falling over her face, eyes that darted down the moment anyone looked her way. She never waved, never spoke, always barefoot, always pale, always silent. For those who dared to ask questions, the hollow closed ranks immediately. Her father was feared, but more than that, he was protected. In places where kinship is stronger than law, to challenge one man is to challenge an entire bloodline. Questions were met with blank stares or laughter. "You've been listening to too many ghost stories," locals would say, or worse, a hard silence that felt like a warning. Outsiders learned quickly not to push. Still, the truth surfaced in unexpected ways. A nurse in a county clinic spoke years later about a young woman from the hills who came in with deep bruises, claiming she had fallen. But the injuries told another story. They were patterns of violence, repeated and deliberate. The nurse filed a report, but nothing came of it. The sheriff, when asked, muttered something about mountain ways and closed the case before it even began. And so her prison walls thickened, not made of concrete, but of silence, denial, and complicity. Even religion failed her. The church that might have spoken against such sin kept its doors shut. Ministers feared crossing families who had lived there for generations, and so sermons were preached about general sins, about pride and greed, but never about the atrocity taking place just a few miles down the road. The girl's world shrank smaller and smaller. The cabin was both her home and her tomb. Each day she followed the same routine, fetching water, tending the fire, cooking meals for a man who called himself both her father and her husband. At night, the silence deepened into something unbearable. Some said they could hear her muffled sobs carried on the wind, though no one dared to approach. Years later, locals would claim the hollow was cursed, that nothing good ever grew there, that even animals avoided the land. But the curse was no mystery. It was not supernatural. It was born of choices, of silence, of a family and a community that allowed one of the darkest acts imaginable to root itself in their soil. And she was the one made to bear its fruit. The strangest thing about stories like hers is how quickly they become invisible. By the late 1970s, while America was changing, disco on the radio, protests in the streets, the rise of a modern world, the hollow remained frozen in time. Her suffering was absorbed into the silence of daily life, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Families still gathered for Sunday suppers, children still played in dusty yards, men still hauled timber down the ridges, and yet beneath that surface of ordinary life, everyone knew. They knew who she was. They knew what had been done, and they chose to look away. Neighbors described her as a ghost long before she died. She rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was so faint people leaned in to catch the words. She stopped looking others in the eye, as if direct contact might betray too much of the truth. She moved like someone carrying a weight far heavier than her body could bear, her back hunched, her hands clasped tight against her chest. People pitied her. But pity is not the same as courage. Pity does not break silence. Her father carried on with pride. He walked the roads of the hollow with his head high, daring anyone to question him, and no one did. To challenge him was to risk exile, or worse. The law, when called, dismissed rumors as family matters. Local officials claimed there was no evidence, no complaint, nothing they could act on. The girl herself never spoke out. Perhaps because she knew no one would save her. In a world where every authority figure looked the other way, silence became her only shield. By then, the toll on her body was evident. Thin, frail, often seen limping, she seemed aged far beyond her years. Women whispered she had lost more than one pregnancy, that the children she carried rarely survived. Others hinted that one child lived hidden away in the cabin, raised under the same suffocating rules that he had crushed her. If true, that child would now be middle-aged, perhaps still living quietly in the mountains, carrying forward the unspoken legacy of a cursed union. The valley carried these secrets like stones in its pockets, heavy, deadly, yet never dropped. For them, survival meant silence, and so the girl, now a young woman, drifted through her days like a shadow stitched into the fabric of the land, present but never truly alive. As the years dragged on, the story of the bride became more than a single tragedy. It became a mirror, reflecting the sickness buried in the hollow's roots. In every generation there had been whispers of such unions, though never spoken above a whisper. An uncle marrying his niece, cousins whose blood ties were far too close, children born with features that revealed too much about the true nature of their family tree. People outside the valley dismissed these tales as hillbilly legends, grotesque exaggerations told to mock mountain folk. But to those who lived there, they were not legends. They were memory. And what made her story different was how unashamed her father was. Others in the past had tried to conceal their crimes behind lies or half-truths. They had insisted their brides were distant relatives, their children legitimate, their practices misunderstood. But he never bothered with such disguises. He carried on as though he had the right, as though the silence of his neighbors was proof of his authority. In his eyes he had preserved the family line, kept the blood unbroken, and fulfilled the legacy of those before him. For the girl, this meant her suffering was public, even if no one dared to name it. Every trip to the creek, every appearance at the store in the nearby town, was a cruel reminder that everyone knew, and that no one would help her. Some say this was when she began to change in ways more haunting than silence alone. Her eyes, once downcast, began to hold a distant, vacant stare, like someone already halfway departed from this world. She did not fight. She did not plead. It was as if her soul had slipped into hiding, leaving only the shell of her body behind. Still, fragments of her story managed to escape. A former teacher remembered her as a child, suddenly withdrawn from school without explanation. A nurse recalled her faint voice when asked about her injuries. "I fell." A neighbor years later swore that late one night he heard her sobbing echo through the valley, so raw and broken that it kept him awake until morning. He never told anyone until decades had passed. Fear had tied his tongue then, just as it tied everyone else's. Her suffering was not just her own, it was shared in silence by an entire community that chose cowardice over truth. And in that silence, the curse of the hollow only deepened, spreading like roots beneath the soil, too twisted to ever be fully untangled. By the end of the 1970s, the girl was no longer spoken of as a daughter or even as a wife. She had become something else entirely, a figure of shame, a shadow the valley tried to hide. Outsiders who asked too many questions were told to mind their own business. Families who lived nearby began avoiding her cabin, taking longer routes just to keep from passing it. And yet, despite every effort to bury her story, it clung to the land like smoke from a fire that refused to burn out. There are accounts, small, fragmented, of attempts to intervene. A social worker from the county once made the climb into the hollow after receiving an anonymous letter. She claimed she saw the girl briefly on a porch, thin as a wisp, with bruises visible even in the dim light. But when she asked questions, she was met with a wall of denial. The father spoke for everyone, insisting his daughter was fine, that she was simply frail, not abused. Relatives backed his claims. And with no official records, no marriage license, no birth certificates for the children, there was nothing legal to hold him accountable. The social worker left defeated and never returned. Her body, however, kept telling the truth. More than one doctor noted strange injuries, pregnancies too frequent for a girl her age, and symptoms of malnutrition. But the people of the valley knew how to close ranks. They told doctors she was clumsy, that food was scarce, that accidents happened in the mountains. Each excuse, flimsy as it was, became another brick in the wall that kept her trapped. Some stories suggest she bore more than one child in those years. None of them appear in records. Their fates remain uncertain. Some say the babies died young, their graves unmarked, hidden under stones at the edge of the property. Others believe at least one survived, raised in secrecy, growing up with the same twisted silence hanging over the. If true, that child would now be in their 40s or 50s, living quietly somewhere in Kentucky, carrying the face of a bloodline that was never meant to exist. The valley itself seemed to suffer under the weight of what had happened. Crops failed, cabins collapsed, and families began to scatter. Some whispered it was a curse, the land itself rejecting what had been done. Others simply called it justice, that no place could thrive when such sins were allowed to root themselves so deeply. By the early 1980s, the story of the inbred bride was already fading into rumor. Outsiders passing through the county might hear fragments in gas stations or late-night diners. There was a girl once, married her own father, but nobody talks about it now. The locals, however, knew better. They remembered her face, her silence, her body wasting away as if the life had been drained from her by something far older than cruelty, a kind of generational rot that had taken root long before she was born. Her father grew older, heavier, meaner. Witnesses describe him sitting on the porch, rocking slowly, a shotgun across his knees. Children were warned not to wander near his property. Grown men lowered their voices when his name was spoken. And the girl, now a woman, though still spoken of as if she were frozen in time, was seen less and less. Years went by where no one in the hollow claimed to have laid eyes on her. Some said she rarely left the cabin at all, that her body had broken down too much to carry out even daily chores. Others whispered she had gone completely mad, muttering to herself in the dark, clinging to scraps of quilts as though they were the only thing holding her together. There are unverified accounts of her trying to escape. A driver once claimed to have picked up a barefoot woman walking along a back road in the dead of night. She said almost nothing except, "He's going to find me." But before he could take her into town, headlights appeared behind them. She panicked, begged to be let out, and vanished into the woods. The driver swore it was her. No one believed him. By then, her name had been erased from official memory. No documents, no marriage license, no recorded birth date for the children she might have borne. The hollow had covered its tracks well. To the state, she barely existed. To the valley, she was a secret best left buried. But the people, who had seen her, even from a distance, carried the memory like a stone in their chest. They had looked into the eyes of someone who had been erased while still alive, and they never forgot it. Some claim she died in those years. Others insist she lived much longer, hidden, her death never recorded, her grave never marked. What is certain is that the silence surrounding her deepened, thickening into legend. A legend too haunting to dismiss and too dangerous to speak aloud. The most chilling thing about her story is how it refuses to die. Every time the hollow tried to smother it, whispers carried it farther. By the mid-1980s, younger generations, those who had not seen her directly, were telling fragments in hushed tones around campfires. They spoke of a pale woman who wandered the woods, her hair tangled, her eyes hollow, her footsteps silent as ash. Some swore they had seen her ghost by the creek, clutching something wrapped in cloth, rocking it as if it were a child. Others said they heard her sobbing echo through the trees on moonless nights. Whether these were hauntings of the dead or hauntings of the living, no one could say for certain. But one thing was clear. The hollow would never be free of her. Every abandoned cabin, every collapsed barn, seemed to carry her memory. Travelers passing through described the place as wrong, though they couldn't explain why. Locals knew the answer. The land itself had absorbed her suffering. It lingered in the soil, in the air, in the silence that blanketed every conversation. Her story had become the valley's shadow. And yet, to this day, there are people who insist she survived far longer than anyone admits. Some say she was alive into the 1990s, hidden away, her face never seen, her name never spoken. Others claim her descendants still walk among us, unknowing carriers of a bloodline that should never have existed. These theories blur the line between history and folklore, but the effect is the same. They remind us that some sins are too great to remain in the past. They echo forward, reshaping lives long after the original crime has ended. And if you're still watching this, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have broken the silence, or would fear have bound your tongue the way it bound an entire community for decades? Because that is the true terror of this story. Not only what one man did to his daughter, but what everyone else allowed. Silence was the accomplice. Denial was the shield, and fear was the chain that held her tighter than any lock or shackle ever could. That is why, whether she is alive or gone, her presence has never left. The hollow is still hers. And so we arrive at the end, though in truth there is no end to a story like this. The girl who became a bride against her will, the daughter who was forced to stand beside her own father as a wife, never received justice. Not from the law, not from her community, not even from the passage of time. She was written out of history, erased from records, buried in silence. And yet her ghost, whether real or imagined, still clings to the Appalachian soil like ivy around an abandoned home. The final truth is difficult to face. This was not just one family's horror. It was a reflection of something larger, a society that looked away, a culture of silence that decided survival was worth more than truth, an entire valley complicit in hiding the very thing that made them shudder in the dark. That is why her story feels so heavy, because it is not only hers, it is a reminder that darkness thrives when silence protects it. Perhaps she lies in an unmarked grave somewhere in Kentucky, her bones mingled with the earth, her name carried only in whispers. Perhaps her children, if they survived, live ordinary lives today, never knowing the full horror of their origin. Or perhaps they know, and they carry that knowledge like a curse, never daring to speak it aloud. Whatever the case, the silence has failed. The story has slipped through the cracks, and here you are, listening to it now. If this tale has haunted you, It was meant to. Because these are not just legends, they are buried truths. They remind us that history is not only written in books, it lives in the shadows, in the secrets no one wants to remember. And if you found yourself disturbed, uneasy, unable to look away, then you have felt the weight of the past pressing against the present. That weight is real. That weight is hers. Before we close, let me ask you one final thing. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten or gotten, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who thinks history is only dates and wars. Let them see the other side, the hidden side, because the past is not gone, it is watching, always. Until next time, keep your eyes open, for the past does not sleep.